Let's break down 6 last-minute waiver wire ads at running back and wide receiver who may be able to help you guys in the second round of the fantasy playoffs if you guys are in need of a desperation start heading into Week 16. All right, let's kick the video off with Patrick Taylor of the San Francisco 49ers. As many of you guys know by now, he is set to be the lead back for the Niners going into Week 16 against the Miami Dolphins, as Isaac Guerrero is the latest Niners running back to get hit by the running back injury curse that the Niners running backs have had all season long. He's dealing with both a foot and hamstring injury, and as of today, he has been ruled out for this weekend's matchup. So, Patrick Taylor, according to reports, is the next man up. We saw him get some work in Week 14 against the Bears, scored a touchdown in that game, has basically done nothing else on the season. Had a couple snaps in Week 6 against Seattle, but primarily we've just seen him in Week 14, then was only on the field for 6% of snaps this past week. So I don't know exactly what to expect here, but the general thesis has been if a Niners running back is out there and he's a starting guy, he should have fantasy value, and so far throughout the season, we've seen that between the backups to Christian McCaffrey and Jordan Mason, as well as Isaac Guerrero. But it's worth noting, I suppose, that you just never know what you're going to get out of a Kyle Shanahan offense. So listen, I'm not going out of my way to start Patrick Taylor. He's still a desperation start to me. I know some of you guys may not feel the most confident in your RB2s. It's Week 16. Try not to overthink this one. Patrick Taylor is a fine spot play, but we still have no idea what to expect here. And this Niners team, this offense, still kind of up and down as of late. But he sits at 42% rostered. He's still worth picking up to see what happens this week and next week, assuming that Isaac Guerrero misses next week as well, right? But like I said, don't be going out of your way, benching players who have given you production all season long, even if it's been spotty, just to start Patrick Taylor because he's the San Francisco 49ers starting running back in Week 16. I still think he is a spot play at best, but it's not an awful matchup against the Dolphins. This game is on the road in Miami, but Patrick Taylor definitely startable, only sitting at 42% rostered. Could definitely be a valuable last-minute waiver ad going into Week 16. All right, next up, we have Kendre Miller of the New Orleans Saints sitting at 44% rostered, and Alvin Kamara still is not technically out for Week 16, but he is now listed as doubtful going into Monday's matchup against the Green Bay Packers, and Alvin Kamara did not practice yesterday or on Friday. Depends on when you guys are watching this video, but nonetheless, not looking like Kamara is going to be good to go, although technically the Saints have one extra day as this is the Monday Night Football game. So that's going to leave Kendre Miller as the next man up. And I'm a little bit surprised that he still is only sitting at 44% roster. But nonetheless, this is another one where I think Kendre Miller is very startable, a good spot play, but try not to overthink this one. Once again, don't be benching running backs who we can count on in terms of production for Kendre Miller just because he's a starting running back. The Green Bay Packers are not that bad against the run. This game is in Green Bay. And then overall, I mean, the Saints offense, like we got Spencer Rattler, Jake Haener at quarterback, no real wide receivers. MVS is the wide receiver one on this team. Taysom Hill's hurt. Kamara, I mean, it's a little bit of a dumpster fire here. I do think Kendre Miller is startable, once again, similar to Patrick Taylor, but I just don't quite know what to expect. 9.2 fantasy points out of Kendre Miller in Week 14, 4.6 in Week 15. So Week 14, 32 yards on the ground, scored a touchdown. Week 15, got 9 touches and had 46 yards on the ground. I mean, a lot of people like Kendre Miller coming out of college, myself included, but I just don't know if this is a great overall spot. Nonetheless, he should be their RB1 this weekend. Should give you some sort of floor. I just don't know how high the upside is going to be. Packers defense has looked good as of late. Kendre Miller is definitely startable, but I just want to remind you guys, it's Week 16. It's the second round of the fantasy playoffs. Try not to outsmart yourself. Kendre Miller, a very suitable spot play, but that might be it going into Week 16. We'll find out. And then let's talk about the Raiders running backs, Alexander Madison as well as Amir Abdullah. This is a very interesting situation, right? Sincere McCormick, who I thought may be a potential league winner, is now on IR. And now we kind of have a split committee between Madison and Abdullah. Madison kind of being like the 3-down, like traditional running back in between the tackles, goal line guy, then Amir Abdullah getting that work in the passing games. So Abdullah had a big week this past week with 19.6 fantasy points as he had 7 targets, 7 catches, 58 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Did nothing on the ground, essentially. The Madison got more work on the ground, but just 7 carries for 21 total yards, 3 yards per carry. Didn't look great and had a fumble that was lost in that game against the Falcons as well. But we know that Madison has had some solid production on the season. Nonetheless, they're playing the Jaguars this week. Then in week 17, they play the Saints. 2 great matchups, but what exactly is this split going to look like? Where is the volume going to be? Is Abdullah actually going to get targets this week? We're probably going to get a different quarterback. Actually, we more than likely are going to get Aiden O'Connell as the starting quarterback as he's come off of the injury report. So no real reason why Aiden O'Connell won't start this week over Desmond Ridder, who we got this past week. And it's just like, it's another one of these situations where the matchup makes it much more intriguing than the last 2 players we talked about. In the Week 17 matchup makes it even more intriguing, But what is this split going to look like? It's really difficult to call. I think Abdullah has a bit more upside. We've also seen Amir Abdullah have some upside since like week 11 in the passing game. Since week 11, he has 3 receiving touchdowns, and in each game that he has a receiving touchdown, he has double-digit fantasy points. And Madison, like I said, has had some solid production. Between weeks 1 and 7, he gave you double digits in every game except for 2, and then kind of just fell off. And then he got hurt as well as Amir White got a little bit more involved. Sincere McCormick popped up for a game or 2. But now Madison is back. So it's just a weird situation. But like I said, once again, the matchups make it very intriguing. Alexander Madison sits at 55% rostered. Amir Abdullah sits at 29% rostered. If you're desperate, you need a spot play at running back. These are the other 2 guys that you can run to the waiver wire to potentially add going into week 16. And hey, you're going to cross your fingers on these Raiders running backs. The offense should be better than this past week with O'Connell at quarterback. And B, the matchup really good this week. And really good once again in week 17 as they will face 2 bottom 5 run defenses in fantasy football over the next 2 weeks. See what happens here, but that's about all you've got for your last minute running backs going into week 16. All right, let's take a look at a few wide receivers, and let's talk about Jalen McMillan, who we've talked a lot about throughout the week, dating back to the early waiver video on the week and the sneaky starts video yesterday as well. I really like McMillan going into the week. It's a great matchup against the Dallas Cowboys. He's been super solid over the past 2 games with 3 touchdowns in his last 2 games, 21.9 fantasy points in week 14, 18.5 fantasy points in week 15, and he sits at just 46% rostered. And on top of that, a great matchup against the Cowboys on Sunday Night Football. And once again, the Buccaneers are going to provide for a solid game script as they are not going to take their foot off the gas in this matchup against the Cowboys as they are trying to ensure that they win the NFC South as they are only 1 game ahead of the Falcons. And don't forget, the Falcons beat the Bucs twice already on the season. So that division is still very close overall. This is a must-win game for the Buccaneers. The Cowboys playing for nothing, but they've shown on the season here in the late part of the season that they are not one of these teams that's just going to keel over, right? And this game's in Dallas. So overall, I think this is actually going to be a pretty good game script, and I think that the Cowboys could actually do a little bit of damage against this Buccaneers secondary. So we'll see what happens, but ultimately it should be a good game script, and McMillan has shown us some really solid production over the past 2 weeks. So if you're desperate for a flex going into week 16, desperate for a last-minute wide receiver, I really believe that Jalen McMillan is going to be about as good as it's going to get Once again, sitting at just 46% rostered. I would be trying to roster him even if I don't really need a flex option. He gets the Panthers in week 17 as well. It's not a great matchup on paper. The Panthers have not been that bad against wide receivers, but this is still one of those game scripts, once again, that could turn into a positive situation for the Bucs passing attack and McMillan. So if McMillan's out there, I think he's overall a very solid ad and definitely a viable play going in to week 16. And I know I talked about this line on Underdog in yesterday's video as well, but I still feel great about Jalen McMillan's total receiving yards on Underdog, currently sitting at 37.5 receiving yards. He has smashed that in his last two matchups, and this week 16 matchup is a better matchup on paper than the Raiders or the Chargers. So I'm headed straight to Underdog to take the over on McMillan's total receiving yards. Don't forget, all new users who sign up using promo code THECATCH on Underdog, that link is down below, are getting a free NFL Pick'em to use towards Week 16's action. Take your free Pick'em. Take the over on McMillan's total receiving yards. Once both of those lines hit, you'll automatically triple your cash entry. And on top of that, as long as you guys sign up on Underdog using promo code THECATCH, Underdog is also going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. Okay, next up, I want to talk about Malik Washington, a player I talked about in the early waiver video on the week, and we now have word that Jalen Waddle is doubtful for week 16 as he is still dealing with that knee injury that he suffered in week 15, which I don't think this really is surprising to a lot of people, because if you saw the injury, I mean, it looked pretty bad, but then the initial reports were that, he avoided a major injury, but, his playing availability for week 16 was it was basically still completely up in the air, and I have always viewed him throughout this week as he's probably not going to play. And Malik Washington is the next man up at wide receiver. Tyreek Hill is more than likely going to play. He is also technically dealing with an injury going into the week as questionable. And the interesting thing with Tyreek Hill is that we knew about the wrist injury, but now he's showing up on the injury report as questionable, also due to a personal matter. So not exactly sure what's going on there. I like Malik Washington more if Tyreek Hill's on the field. I don't think Malik Washington's ready to line up as a wide receiver 1, but as a wide receiver 2, he did some damage this past week against the Texans. 6 targets, 5 catches, 52 receiving yards, and 10.2 fantasy points. So he's a good slot receiver. Liked him coming out of Virginia going into this season and everything. Thought he could potentially carve out a bigger role in this offense. He hasn't really done that, but this could be the opportunity now that Waddle is not going to play this week once again, and Waddle basically missed all of last week. So we'll see what happens, but pay attention to the Tyreek Hill status, because if Hill for some reason doesn't end up playing this week, which I would be surprised by, being that the Dolphins are not eliminated from playoff contention yet, and this is a must-win game. But if Hill's not out there, then I'd probably avoid Malik Washington. But ultimately, even though it's not the strongest matchup against the Niners, there should be some additional volume. I know some of that's going to end up going to A-Chain. Some of it's going to end up going to Jonnu Smith. But ultimately, Malik Washington should be the next man up in this offense, and he could benefit once again in Week 16 like he did in Week 15. And speaking of wide receiver 2s benefiting from other wide receivers being hurt, let's take a look at Calvin Austin of the Pittsburgh Steelers, who got a little bit of bump last week with George Pickens missing Week 15, and George Pickens is going to miss Week 16 as well. Side note, I'm very worried if you own George Pickens. I've been saying this for the past 2.5 weeks or so. I don't think Pickens is going to play at all in the fantasy playoffs, but don't quote me. Probably worth holding on to him in Week 17 just in case, but I got a lot of fear about Pickens being out Week 17 as well. Nonetheless, Calvin Austin, 5 targets, 5 catches, 65 receiving yards, and 11.5 fantasy points in Week 15 in a tough matchup against the Eagles. And then we kind of break it down a little bit further. Calvin Austin has double-digit fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 games, and in 2 of those, George Pickens was active, right? And he scored 2 touchdowns in that stretch as well. So Calvin Austin is easily the next most valuable wide receiver on this team. And I think part of what made me a little bit down on Calvin Austin going into this past week is not really being an option, even though we knew Pickens was out, was I was high on Calvin Austin in week 14, knowing that Pickens was out and that it was a good matchup against the Browns. And he had just one catch and 1.4 fantasy points. So I kind of came off him. Then he did show up in week 15. And now going into week 16, it's a good matchup against the Baltimore Ravens. This secondary has been a little bit better as of late, but they have still given up a tremendous amount of fantasy points to opposing wide receivers on the season. And we still know that the secondary is easily the weakest part of that Ravens defense. So Calvin Austin sits at just 13% rostered. Once again, the additional volume to guys like Mike Williams and Ben Skronik and Van Jefferson. I mean, it's just not enough. I know that Pat Freiermuth has stepped up here, but between the rest of those wide receivers, like looking at week 15 alone, we have 3 catches, a catch to each of those wide receivers. So ultimately, I think Calvin Austin is going to see the majority of the volume here. Maybe Najee Harris or Jalen Warren get a couple catches. And obviously, like I said, Pat Freiermuth is going to see an increase in volume at the tight end position. But in terms of wide receiver, it's Calvin Austin, and it's a good matchup this week. And this should be one of those game scripts where the Steelers are forced to throw the football as well. So everything's there for Austin to come through. I don't know if he's going to have a major game. I don't know that the upside's super high. But like I said, 10 or more fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 matchups. Good matchup against the Ravens. Good game script. Only 13% rostered. If you're desperate for a flex option or an additional wide receiver going into week 16, I think Calvin Austin can easily fill in for your roster in the second round of the fantasy playoffs. And that'll do it for today's video. There are 6 last-minute waiver wire ads heading into Week 16 of the 2024 fantasy football season. As always, guys, I'm answering as many fantasy football questions as I can in the comment section down below. So if you guys need anything whatsoever moving into Week 16, please drop me a comment. I'll get back to as many of you guys as I possibly can. But most importantly, as always, make sure that you guys are subscribed to the channel because we're going to have everything you guys could possibly need to help you guys dominate the rest of the 2024 fantasy football season. So make sure you guys hit that subscribe button so that you don't miss out on any of the videos. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.